The Life of George Washington, in words of one syllable, by Josephine Pollard. Chapter 14. The Close of the War. In the month of May, Cornwallis had planned to bring his troops to Petersburg and strike a blow at Lafayette, who was near Richmond. Lafayette fled as soon as he heard that Cornwallis had crossed the James River, for he had but few troops, and did not care to bring on a big fight till the men came up who were then on the way to aid him. Cornwallis thought he could soon catch "the boy," as he called him, but his youth made him spry, and the redcoats did not get up to him. On June 10th, General Wayne came up with 900 men to add to Lafayette's strength, and this made him change his whole plan. With 4,000 men and Baron Steuben, he might hope to win in a fight with the redcoats, and he turned his face to the foe. Cornwallis was at the time twixt Lafayette and Albemarle Courthouse, where stores were kept. The Marquis, by a night march through a road that had long been out of use, got in front of the King's troops and held them in check. Cornwallis turned back and marched first to Richmond and then to Williamsburg, while Lafayette kept close in his rear. Here they had a fierce fight, in which the loss was great on both sides and the gain but small. At this time word came to Cornwallis that Washington had borne down on New York, and that he must send some of his troops to that town. This would leave him too weak to stay where he was, so on July 4th he set out for Portsmouth. Lafayette gave chase the next day and took post 9 miles from his camp. His plan was to fall on the rear guard when the main force should have crossed the ford at Jamestown, but Cornwallis guessed what he meant to do and laid a trap for him. A sharp fight took place, into which Wayne threw himself like a madman, but the foe were as 10 to 1, and our troops were forced back to Green Springs. In July, Lafayette wrote to Washington that Cornwallis had left Portsmouth by sea, and he thought he was on his way to New York. It was true the troops had gone on board the boats, but though wind and tide were fair, they did not sail. With the French fleet to help him, Washington saw a chance to fight the foe by land and sea, so he turned from New York and marched to Virginia to aid Lafayette, who longed to have his chief at the head of his troops, but did not know he was so near. As our war-worn troops went through Philadelphia, they were hailed with shouts and cheers from the throngs that filled the streets. They kept step to the sound of the drum and fife, and raised a great cloud of dust, for there had been quite a drought. The French troops passed through the next day, but were not in the same style. They made a halt a mile from the town, where they brushed off the dust from their guns and their gay white and green clothes, and then marched with a light step to the sound of a fine band. Crowds were on the streets, and bright smiles and loud shouts met these who had come from France to lay down their lives, if need be, for the cause we had at heart. When Washington turned his back on New York, Sir Henry Clinton sent word to Cornwallis that he would not need the troops he had asked for, so Cornwallis went from Portsmouth to Yorktown, where he took his stand. Yorktown was a small place on the south side of York River. The stream at this point was not more than a mile wide, but it was so deep that ships of large size and weight could go through. Here he threw up works on both sides of the stream, which gave him a fine stronghold, as the banks were high and set out from the mainland. He thought there was no foe near but Lafayette, and had no great fear of one so young. He felt so safe that he wrote to Clinton that he could let him have a large force of men to add strength to New York, where it was thought our troops would strike the next blow. In the meantime Lafayette threw out troops to the rear to work with the French fleets that would soon be in Chesapeake Bay, and so a net was drawn round Cornwallis at a time when he thought he was most safe. Washington was at Philadelphia on September 5th, and at Baltimore 3 days from that time. He left Baltimore on the 9th at daybreak, with but one of his suite, as he was in haste to reach Mount Vernon. The rest of his suite rode at their ease, and joined him the next day at noon. It was 6 years since Washington had seen his old home, and how full of toil and care those years had been. In 3 days he had to leave the dear old place, and with his guests push on to join Lafayette, who was at Williamsburg. By September 25th, the French and our troops were in camp near that town, and at once set to work to get things in train for the next fight. Cornwallis had built forts on the north and south banks of the stream, and had done all he could to add strength to Yorktown. Ships of war were in front, and boats had been sunk at the mouth of the stream. Field works were at the rear with big guns on top, and there were long rows of trees that had been cut down and left so that their limbs stuck out and made a fence it would not be safe to climb. At the right and left of Yorktown were deep dells and creeks, and it was not strange that Cornwallis felt that he was in a sure stronghold. Our troops were 12 miles off when they took up their march on September 28th, and that night they went in camp 2 miles from Yorktown. Washington and his staff slept on the ground, his head on the foot of a tree. The next morn our troops drew out on each side of Beaver Dam Creek, the Americans on the east side and the French on the west. The Count de Grasse with the main fleet stayed in Lynn Haven Bay, so as to keep off the ships that might come from sea to aid the redcoats. On the night of the 1st of October our troops threw up 2 earthworks, on which the redcoats turned their guns at daylight and killed 3 of the men. While Washington stood near the works, a shot struck the ground close by him and threw up a great cloud of dust. One of his staff who stood near was in a great fright, but Washington was calm and showed no signs of fear. On October 6th our troops set out to dig the trench that the first line would use in the siege of Yorktown. So dark was the night, and so still were the men, that the foe did not know of it until daylight. Then they fired on them from the forts, but the men were screened and kept at their work. By the 9th the trench was dug and the guns fixed to fire at the town. Washington put the match to the first gun, and a storm of balls and bombshells dared Cornwallis to come out and fight. For 3 or 4 days the fire was kept up on both sides, and bombshells crossed in mid air, and at night flashed forth like great stars with tails a blaze of light. Our shells did much harm in the town and to the earthworks of the foe. The red hot shot from the French forts northwest of the town reached the King's ship of war. The Sharon, a 44-gun ship, and 3 large boats for troops were set on fire by them. The flames ran up to the tops of the masts, and as the night was dark the scene was a grand one to the eye, but a sad one to the heart. On the night of the 11th a new ditch was dug by the troops led by Baron Steuben, and for 2 or 3 days the foe kept up a fire on the men at work. At 8 o'clock on the night of October 14th they set out to storm both Yorktown and the point on the north bank at the same time. The vanguard of our troops was led by Alexander Hamilton. When at school he wrote to one of his boy friends, "I wish there was a war," and in 1776, when he was all but 19 years of age, he was placed at the head of the men who fired the guns and bombshells. The next year he was aide de camp to Washington, in whom he found a true and wise friend. With great joy and pride Hamilton led the van in a headlong dash past the trees, which they pushed or pulled down with their own hands, where they could not climb them, and was the first to mount the wall. One of his men knelt so that Hamilton could use him for steps, and the rest of the men got up the best way they could. Not a gun was fired, and the fort fell into the hands of our troops with a small loss on both sides. The French stormed the fort at the point in as brave a way, but with less speed, and lost more men. Washington stood on the ground in the grand fort, where he could see all that took place. An aide de camp near him spoke up and said that he ran a great risk from a chance shot through one of the port holes. "If you think so," said Washington, "you can step back." Soon a ball struck the gun in a port hole, rolled on, and fell at his feet. General Knox seized him by the arm. "My dear General," said he, "we can't spare you yet." "It is a spent ball," said Washington in a calm voice. "No harm is done." When each charge was made and both forts were in our hands, he drew a long breath, turned to Knox and said, "The work is done, and well done." Then he said to his black man, "Bring me my horse," and rode off to see where next his lines should move, and how the trap could be closed on Cornwallis. Cornwallis found that he could not hold his forts. No troops had come to his aid, and he would soon have to yield to the foe. This was too much for his pride, so he made up his mind to leave those who were sick or had wounds, and fly from Yorktown. His scheme was to cross the stream at night, fall on the French camp ere daybreak, push on with all speed, and force his way to the north and join Sir Henry Clinton in New York. A large part of his troops had crossed the stream on the night of October 16th, and the rest were on their way when a fierce storm of wind and rain drove the boats down the stream. They could not be brought back till daylight, and it was then too late for them to move on or turn back. The hopes of Lord Cornwallis were at an end, and on the 17th he sent a flag of truce and a note to Washington, and asked that his guns might cease their fire for one day so that terms of peace could be drawn up. Washington feared that in the meantime troops from New York would reach Cornwallis, so he sent word back that his guns would cease their fire for but 2 hours. Washington did not like the terms drawn up by Cornwallis, so he made a rough draft of such terms as he would grant. These were sent to Cornwallis on the 19th, and he was forced to sign them, and in 2 hours his troops were to march out of the forts. At noon our troops were drawn up in 2 lines more than a mile in length, the Americans on the right side of the road, the French on the left. At 2 o'clock the redcoats passed out with slow steps, and were led to a field where they were to ground their arms. Some of them in their rage threw down their guns with such force as to well nigh break them. On the day that Cornwallis had been forced to lay down his arms at Yorktown, the large force that was to aid him set sail from New York. They did not reach Chesapeake Bay till October 29th, and when they found they were too late they turned their prows and went back to New York. The downfall of Cornwallis was felt to be a death blow to the war, and a great joy was felt throughout the land. Votes of thanks were sent to Washington, to de Rochambeau, and to de Grasse, and Washington gave high praise to all the troops for the way in which they had fought at the siege of Yorktown. From that time the redcoats lost heart, and on November 25th, 1783, they marched out of New York, and Washington marched in at the head of his brave men, who had fought and bled and borne all the ills that flesh could bear, that the land they loved might be free. In a few days Washington was called to Annapolis to meet with those who had made the laws, and his chief men, who had been with him through all the sad scenes of the war, came to bid him good bye. With a heart full of love he said to them, "I cannot come to each of you to take my leave, but shall be glad if each of you will come and take me by the hand." This they did. No one spoke a word. Tears were in all their eyes. Washington left the room and went on foot to the boat which lay at the end of what was then, and is now, Whitehall Street. His friends kept close in the rear. When Washington was in his barge he turned, took off his hat, and waved good bye, and those on shore did the same, and watched the barge till it passed out of their sight. End of chapter 14.